County. And we're very excited to be here today with Rabbi Joshua Hammerman. Just a few things before we get started about Zoom etiquette. For one thing, I am now going to record the session. If you, it is recording. Okay, so if you do not want your picture or your name up, so you'll have to take care of that. There's a little picture of a video camera and the word stop video if you don't want your picture up. And you'll have to change your name if you don't want your name to appear. So just know that we're recording. We are going to have a question and answer session, and I believe Rabbi Hammerman is no stranger to questions, but what we'd like to do is ask you to type your questions in the chat. If we have, if we have some time at the end, we'll open up so that people can talk as well. But let's play that by ear. Okay. So you are all muted, and I do suggest that you click on, after you've seen all of the participants and read all the names, I do suggest that you click on speaker view so that the person is highlighted who is speaking, and that would be, of course, Rabbi Hammerman. Yeah, he already. I am now going to introduce Marcy Schoenfeld, who is, you're unmuted, Marcy, who is going to, who is our Vice President of Programming for the Jewish Historical Society, who will also welcome you and tell you about two exciting programs after this amazing program. Okay. Marcy?
Hi, I'm Marcy. I'm in charge of programs and book talks. And we decided at a meeting to really go to Zoom. So we have Zoom meetings, but we also had our first book talk last month on Zoom. And now we're even thinking about, even though we normally close down after this event today, we are continuing to throughout the summer because we feel there's a need to do these things. We already have booked for June 23rd, Tuesday at 7 p.m. I call it book talk / program. It's Debbie Levinson, who wrote a book called The Crate that got very good reviews. And it's subtitled A Story of War, a Murder, and Justice. It's really the story of her mother. I know she's spoken to a lot of groups, including some 2G people who told me very good things about her. So keep that in mind. If you want, you can actually buy the book on either Goodreads or Amazon. Her last name is Levinson, Levison, Deborah. And the book is called The Crate. And we're working on other programs, other book talks to continue over the summer.
That's right. And we welcome you as well to our
can I say one other thing?
Our annual meeting, which is June 3rd, which will feature the Family Store 1940 to 1965, the history of the store in downtown Stanford, and it's going to be visual and auditory, and you're going to really enjoy it. So look for information about that. That's a Wednesday night at 7. Okay, everyone.
Okay, one other thing, that if you know someone who does not get emails, so doesn't know about any of this, please become their buddy, call them, tell them about things. For example, I have someone who's calling me on my phone so they can at least can hear this. There are phone numbers listed on each of the events that say they can call. I don't know if you have to have a mobile phone for that or a regular phone. I don't know. But
okay, thanks, Marcy. Okay, so we're moving right along. I was going to say everyone is welcome to all of our programs and our book talks and anything we do. We're delighted to have you, and of course we're open to the public and they're free of charge. But here's the commercial. To help us serve you better, we encourage you to become a member. It's such a deal. Okay, so please check that out on our website. So We are delighted to welcome Rabbi Joshua Hammerman today, and with Embracing Auschwitz. And okay, you're going to explain that title, right?
I
Okay,
will.
I hope so. Okay, so congratulations on the publication of this book, #1 on theology on Amazon. Rabbi Hammerman has been at Temple Bethel since before I was born, actually 1992. And he's the noted cyber Rebbe, using the internet long before he had to. You might want to check out his blog on One Foot. It's followed worldwide. And he has a column by the same name that appears regularly in the New York Jewish Week. And that's happened since 1994. Rabbi Hammerman was ordained at the Jewish Theological Seminary in 1983 after receiving a master's degree in journalism from NYU and a BA magna cum laude from Brown University. And in 2010, he was awarded an honorary doctorate from JTS. So you're Dr. Rabbi Hammerman. Okay. Coming originally
I have the diplomas behind me in this virtual background, just so you would remember that.
Good. I'm carefully reading them. And coming from the Boston area, he is not shy about rooting for the Red Sox, but we don't hold that against him. He lives here in Stamford with his wife, Dr. Mara Hammerman, and she's a psychologist. They have 2 children, Ethan and Daniel, whom I happen to know pretty well, and they're great guys. When is the next life cycle event in the Hammerman family? Well, we'll talk about that later. Okay, along with 2 standard poodles. So with all of this, do you want to find out about Embracing Auschwitz? So let's give a warm welcome to Rabbi Joshua Hammerman.
Okay.
Okay, take it away.
So warm that I can't even hear you. This is a very strange kind of environment for doing a book talk, but it actually has its advantages. I'll be able to do a reading, and you'll be able to read along with me through some of this book. Anyway, when Lisa and I were talking about this almost a year ago, doing this session, it was not supposed to be about this book. It was supposed to be about my prior book that came out last year, Benchmarks, which I guess I can't really show you with this virtual background. But anyway, there it is. All right, so now we've done it. You've seen it. And it's a good book. It's worth buying. Go out and get it. And it actually has relevance to our time. But I think this current book, Embracing Auschwitz, does even more. And it happened to have been published a week ago. The plan was for it to have sort of, a nice launch, but what we're dealing with right now is nothing is normal. And so I understand Amazon is out of them already, and the printers haven't really started catching up with a lot of printing orders, but they will be back in stock. So you can still go ahead and order it, and you can order it on an ebook, and you can be reading it right away for a lot less money. But anyway, so it was worth sort of updating this lecture to not be about my last book, but be about this book, and to introduce it. And in fact, this is the launching as best we can do right now. This is sort of our virtual launching. So I'm thrilled to be here today. I'm thrilled to be working with the Jewish Historical Society and support so much of what it does. I've been here so long that I'm sort of part of it right now. I mean, we're all part of the history of Jewish Stamford in our own way. And that's one reason we're recording today, because I think this is an important moment too, certainly for me, and I think for all of us. Anyway, so the Holocaust ended 75 years ago this month. So that by itself tells us that we should be talking about this, that this is an important moment, that a certain amount of time has passed, that when this amount of time passes, something changes. It's not just a generational change, it's almost an existential change. For Jews, when we sit Shiva, we sit for 7 days. We just read last week's Torah portion about the cycles of 7 years, the sabbatical cycle. The 70-year mark, 70, 75 years, has always been an important one in Jewish history. It's always been a point at which things have changed, at which tragedies start to be understood in new ways. Now, the Holocaust is by no means like any other tragedy, not just in Jewish history, but anywhere, ever. But if you look through Jewish history, you'll see just how that rule has led to amazing things. The first temple was destroyed. About 70 years later, they returned for the second temple's rebuilding, but with something in hand called the Torah. The Torah was created as that period of Shiva, of mourning, came to a close, and the Jews began to understand themselves in a very different way, and they began to adapt, a word we're hearing so much lately. Second temple was destroyed, and then the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132 led to, about 70 years later, the creation of the Mishnah, the Talmud, the oral law, which changed Judaism dramatically without a temple. The Spanish expulsion in 1492 led almost exactly 70 years later to the flourishing of the Kabbalistic community of Sfat, and the growth of Kabbalah changed Judaism beyond compare. And finally, in 1648, a horrible destruction occurred in Eastern Europe, in Poland, the Khmelnytsky massacres. You should learn your Jewish history if you don't know what that is. It was, until the Holocaust, it was sort of like a mini Holocaust in its own way. And that led to utter devastation. But at the same time, almost exactly 70 years later, to the beginning of a flowering of Hasidism. In fact, the early Hasids said that the Baal Shem Tov was brought to this earth to comfort the Jews after that horrible disaster. So that's just like a little historical background. We are now 75 years since the Holocaust. 75 years ago, it ended this month. But of course, we know the Holocaust never really ended. Its stature has, in fact, grown. And that's what my book is really about. So here we got the title. Hope you can all see it. And I'm going to show you some slides here in my screen sharing. So this is one of those Google Ngram viewers you can do on Google, in Chrome, wherever. You can chart the usage of a word. Now, it doesn't come up to the current day, but it sort of brings us to about a decade ago. And if you look at the usage of the word Holocaust, I'd say it's flattening out, but I don't want to say that. But the curve of the use of the word Holocaust is still rising, actually, dramatically since the 1960s. 20 years after the Holocaust happened, the word began to be seen and known and become universal. But then it just jumped dramatically, and it still is rising. So you have the sense of the use of the word Holocaust and how it's become immersed in our culture. A couple of weeks ago, I was on Twitter, a very dangerous thing to do. I don't recommend it. You cannot run your life on Twitter, but it's culturally significant to know what's trending on Twitter. Well, who was trending number one during the middle of the pandemic? Anne Frank. Anne Frank was number one on Twitter. And when we think about it, the Holocaust is mentioned in so many ways. It's been mentioned in relation to almost every political event. You know, the term fake news, for instance, was invented by the Nazis. I mean, everywhere you turn, you get Holocaust-related references. Well, Anne, it turns out, has been trending a lot because Anne Frank has such great relevance to especially the teenagers. The Anne Frank Museum's director, Ronald Leopold, said that the present situation affords a small taste of what it means to be immobilized by historical circumstances. Now, there is no way we can compare what Anne Frank went through to what a typical child is going through stuck in their house during a pandemic. However, for the kids, they do feel that way. And in a strange way, so did Anne. Because remember, her diary was incredibly optimistic. and incredibly naive in its own way and wonderfully childish. And Anne Frank was actually, she wrote before the things that happened to her happened. Her diary ended before she went to the camps, before her horrific death, before the Holocaust's horrible nature became fully known. So Anne Frank isn't that different and is some way analogous to the kids going through this pandemic now. But for whatever reason, she trended. Also, the museum decided to put out an imagined video blog, a vlog of Anne Frank as if she were living, in today's technological world, but living through her world. So kids could relate to that too. All right, so I don't think I need to make the claim to all of you that the Holocaust maintains relevance and maybe is more relevant than ever, even 75 years later, but in a different way. So let me get to the question of the title, because the title is interesting. It is something that some people have questioned. Yitzhak Greenberg, the great Holocaust, probably the greatest in our generation, Holocaust scholar and an inspirational rabbi, one of my teachers, wrote an incredible review. He said, if there's one book people should read, it's this book. But he also was repelled by the title. So anyway, what could I do? But here's the first page of the book. Here we go. Let me get this out there right from the start so that there will be absolutely no confusion. There was nothing good about the Holocaust. What happened during the period of Nazi hegemony over Germany and Europe was the nadir of human history. No other historic event is remotely comparable, and it is hard to conceive of any future atrocity being so maliciously designed and meticulously carried out on so vast a scale. So any Holocaust denier who walks into a bookstore and sees this title, I hope will read the first page. Actually, I hope will buy the book because, hey, it doesn't matter who buys the book. And then maybe read the first page and realize he has been gypped out of his money, because I am not going to agree with those who think the Holocaust was something good or something deniable, which, by the way, is a total inconsistency. A Holocaust denier will say, this was the most wonderful thing that never happened. So figure that out. Anyway, what do I mean by embracing Auschwitz? It's not about getting over it, for sure. It's about understanding its full implications. It's about fully incorporating its lessons into our souls and recognizing that, in fact, the Holocaust is not only part of our story, it frames our story, it is our story, and it is our greatest responsibility and honor to bear witness and to share that story. So let me tell you a little bit about how this book came about. And many of you who are on this in this chat room have been part of that. In fact, anyone who's at Temple Bethel certainly knows to some extent what this is all about. And I will show you. So in the summer of 2017, I led a group of my congregants on a pilgrimage to Auschwitz and other sacred sites in Europe, and then explored some of these themes in a series of high holiday sermons when we returned. Those sermons were the inspiration for this book. You can save yourself a little money and go to my blog and just go to those sermons, and this is much better than the sermons. But anyway, the sermons were definitely the spark that led to this book. Previously, back in 2010, I visited these places for the first time, escorting a group of teens on the March of the Living, an annual pilgrimage of thousands of Jewish teens who gather at Auschwitz on Holocaust Remembrance Day and march the approximately 1.5 miles from Auschwitz I, the original camp, to Birkenau, also known as Auschwitz II. I should point out parenthetically, and it is mentioned elsewhere in the book, that Dr. Hesh-Romanowitz was my inspiration and backer for myself and for the group and the Holocaust Memorial Committee for my being able to go on this March of the Living. And he was so helpful that he even substitute taught for Mara so that she could join us as a psychologist on that trip. Anyway, I talk about here that transformative visit for me as the bus from Krakow passed small villages on the hour-long route to Auschwitz. It was hard to believe we were approaching the place I'd heard about all these years. And I talk about my first impression of Auschwitz I, that it built of orangey colored brick. The buildings of Auschwitz I are less evocative of hell on earth than some neighborhoods in Queens. So ordinary, a first glimpse of what Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil, though what went on inside these buildings was simply the greatest crime against humanity of all time. And we saw close up what that was like. And being able to be there during the March of the Living also showed me a different dimension of the Holocaust. Remember, these are all kids back in 2010 who were second, third generation of survivors' families, or just of Jews who lived during the time of the Holocaust. None of them had any remote personal memories, and they were celebrating. I was standing there in the middle of hell on earth, and they were celebrating. They were treating it like an Olympic village. It was not in bad taste. It was wonderful. There was so much excitement. It was like spring break in its own way, a high school mixer just before Thanksgiving. And the millions of dead, wherever they lay, seemed to be celebrating along with us during this astounding display of teenage Jewish hormones in full bloom. This ultimate repudiation of the Nazis, right in the heart of the valley of the shadow of death. And it made me realize that the final solution had turned out to not be so final after all. 7+ decades after Auschwitz, something is happening. Something new is emerging. And this book contains the first peek into what that something new looks like. So I hope you can begin to understand my logic. You may not agree with it in talking about this in a very different way, but I hope you'll at least understand why I felt it was so important to use a title that would be a little bit jarring, but also in my mind, very true, that it is time to, in our own way, embrace the Holocaust, to understand that the Holocaust is something very different from what it was for the prior generations. When I was in college, I studied with another great professor, Jacob Neusner at Brown, who talked a lot about two Judaisms, the Judaism of Sinai and the Judaism of Auschwitz, Judaism of Holocaust and redemption, as he called it. We also see that in the works of people like David Hartman, Professor David Hartman, the philosopher, and of course Yitz Greenberg and other Holocaust historians and philosophers. And they talk about the Judaism that existed up until Auschwitz and the Holocaust form of Judaism that has become, for American Jews, part of our civil religion, very much enmeshed in federation and in fundraising, and of course in Israel. So for Neusner, he was a bit of an elitist, and he felt that the true Judaism was the one in the ivory tower. It was the one in the academy. It was the one in the Talmudic scholarship that he championed. And that this Judaism of Auschwitz and Israel, this Judaism of Holocaust and redemption, was not positive and not helpful. It was a Judaism of victims. It spoke of the Jewish people being redeemed from the clutches of the outside world, whereas the Judaism of Sinai talked about this great movement of freedom and liberation that was led by God and produced a covenant, the covenant of Sinai. The Judaism of Sinai is a glass half full religion, but the Jews since Auschwitz have become a glass half empty people. David Hartman wrote in 1982, Auschwitz or Sinai, I believe it is destructive to make the Holocaust the dominant organizing category of modern Jewish history and of our national renewal and rebirth. It is both politically and morally dangerous for our nation to perceive itself essentially as the suffering remnant of the Holocaust. He concludes, Auschwitz, like all Jewish suffering of the past, must be absorbed and understood within the normative framework of Sinai. We will mourn forever because of the memory of Auschwitz. We will build a healthy new society because of the memory of Sinai. All right, it's been about 3 decades since Hartman wrote that. And that absorption has taken a strange new twist. And so where I differ with Hartman and with Neusner and with Yitz Greenberg back then, and none of them could have possibly known it back then, is that Auschwitz, is that the Holocaust is bringing something positive to the table, or at least something authentic. And it has utterly transformed Sinai, the Judaism of Sinai, in the process of that redemption. So I write in the book, while the Holocaust continues to be a tool for demagogues to manipulate and chicken littles to fundraise, and while memorials and museums often exploit it to promote narrow agendas, something else is happening. No longer does Auschwitz appear as a phenomenon grafted onto the imagination like a tattoo on our souls. Now that tattoo appears to have been there since birth, a natural projection of who we are and how we look at the world, our inherited collective memory. The Holocaust is now part of us. And so each of the chapters of my book outlines an aspect of this work in progress, what I call the Torah of Auschwitz. And we see just how the ways of Sinai are being recast, these old wells redug. And it's an amazing thing to see. And I'm going to try to get us back. No, I do not want Facebook. I do want, hold on. This is what happened when you push the wrong button. All right, so here we go. Auschwitz is now a part of us. The Holocaust is now a part of us. It is at the core of what it means to be a Jew in our day. And here's the proof. This is the 2013 Pew Survey of American Jews. I mean, look at this. The percentage of Jews who say it is an essential part of what it means to be Jewish. And actually, the Israeli survey was done a couple of years later, 2015. Both, and Israeli Jews and US Jews don't agree on just about anything these days. In fact, US Jews don't agree on just about anything these days. In fact, I don't agree with any of you about anything. No, they're just kidding. I'm glad I can't hear laughter right now. 73% of American Jews say remembering the Holocaust is number one. Well, they could have chosen however many they wanted. It is the number one thing that binds us together as Jews. That binds us not only that together as a people, but also gives us meaning. It gives us the sense of what it means to be a Jew. 65% of Israeli Jews. And that includes, by the way, Haredim, who would be much less likely to include the Holocaust, although certain Hasidic denominations are based on having perished and in some way a remnant surviving the Holocaust. But look, leading a moral and ethical life, 69%. Okay. That's good. I mean, I'm glad 69% of US Jews think Judaism wants them to be moral and ethical. Observing Jewish law, 19%. I think I'm in the wrong profession. I don't know. Even caring about Israel or living in Israel, less than half of US Jews feel that living in Israel is essential to their identity as Jews. And then you sort of go down. The interesting one is having a sense of humor on the bottom. It's number 4. Well, I mean, no, maybe 5, but it's higher, much higher than observing Jewish law, having a good sense of humor. Go figure that one out. So this is clearly telling us that we can't ignore the importance of the Holocaust. We can't shove it off to the side. We can't say it's only about fundraisers and about, setting the course of organizational survival. It's only about politics. The Holocaust is so much more than that. It is at the core of who we are. So we should try to understand what it means and who we are. And so this is the table of contents of my book, and you can see that I talk about different, what I call books within this Torah. Of course, Torah is used in a, in a way that I don't want to denigrate, to compare the Torah of the one we put in the ark to anything else. But in fact, in Judaism, Torah is a verb as much as it is a noun. It means to study. It means a collection of study. It means a teaching. So when I talk about the Torah of Auschwitz, I'm talking about what it's teaching. And as you'll see, how it compares to, how it filters, how it redigs the Torah of Sinai, which is about, by the way, which is the same thing that Jews have been doing forever. If you think the Talmud isn't some form of re-envisioning of Judaism and the Torah, it is a totally radical re-envisioning of Judaism, in fact, as is Hasidic Judaism and Kabbalah, as is modern Judaism and Zionism, as is this. So anyway, you can see some of the chapters and what they involve. Let's see this. So we have 13 chapters, basically 12 books, having to do with various elements that we learn from Auschwitz, that the Holocaust teaches us, that are applicable to our day, as related to, as filtered through the Torah of Sinai. Okay? So, also in the book, you will find a digest of mitzvot from the Torah of Auschwitz. And what I'm going to do now is take a few of those mitzvot, and mitzvot, again, I'm not using it in the literal sense. They are not commandments from God, although we can discuss that, but they are based on what we find in the Torah of Sinai and what it means to us post-Auschwitz. So, for instance, you see number 6 here, choose life. So in the Torah, Deuteronomy chapter 30, it says, see, I set before you today life and prosperity, death and destruction, life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life so that you and your children may live, for the Lord is your life. When we look at that expression, choose life, as written in the Torah, you can interpret it in many different ways. Interestingly, it's rarely interpreted in a literal sense, in literal terms. For instance, Rabbi Elliot Kukla has noted, when the Torah states that God puts life and death before us, our tradition is not telling us to decide whether to live or to die, but that every choice we make from birth to death matters. These choices range from how we treat our loved ones, to how we spend our money, from whom we bring into the world, to how we choose our food. In each of these choices, we should choose life. Torah of Auschwitz looks at it a little differently. It teaches that choose life means that we should literally choose survival, to live in the face of death, life in the face of death, to seek the path that will engender survival despite any odds, and that survival itself is victory. Psalm 90 implores, teach us to count our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. The Torah of Auschwitz goes beyond that, imploring us, make those days count, but also add to life by continuing to live. And I should also add, by having children. One of the great miracles and the great wonders of our time is the fact that people in the DP camps got married and had kids after having gone through that, because they wanted to bring more life into the world. So the Torah of Auschwitz is saying, add life, make our lives into a statement also of persistence and courage. So that is an important thing to focus on. My teachers like Rabbi Yitz Greenberg and Neil Gilman have talked about the goal of Judaism being to defeat death, to enable life, the messianic quest, to enable life to emerge triumphant. But I'm saying that the Torah of Auschwitz goes one step farther, more akin to Woody Allen, whom I probably shouldn't bring up these days, who wrote, I don't want to achieve immortality through my work. I want to achieve immortality through not dying. I don't want to live on in the hearts of my countrymen. I want to live on in my apartment. So that we should literally choose life. And the Torah of Auschwitz goes beyond what the Torah of Sinai says. And I think we also can relate it to the life of the Jewish people living on as a nation, which of course, with the creation of the State of Israel, took on a whole new dimension just 3 years after what we are now commemorating of 75 years ago, choosing life. Okay, so let me go to another one. And let's see. So this is just more of the mitzvot. And you notice number 19 on the bottom, Leviticus 19:14, the Torah of Sinai says we should not place a stumbling block before the blind. But the Torah of Auschwitz says, yes, you should place these stumble stones everywhere a victim lived. So let me explain that. This is what you'll find all over Germany. In fact, beyond Germany's borders, all over Europe, and certainly in Berlin. The groups that I've been with in Berlin have seen these everywhere. We talked about them, these Stolperstein, as they're called. These are memorial plates in the ground. Beautiful idea that has been developed. Thousands and thousands. There are actually 56,000 of them throughout Germany. And the idea is that you're never going to walk past a place where Jews lived. And there are entire neighborhoods in Berlin where you'll see that the Jewish community lived that are just, I say littered by, but really just covered in these particular stumble stones in the ground. And you almost trip over them. So if the Torah of Sinai is saying you should not place a stumbling block before the blind, which by the way is a very good law, it means we shouldn't take advantage of someone who has disabilities, for one thing, or someone who's metaphorically blind. We shouldn't fool and deceive people, all wonderful. But in the context of the Torah of Auschwitz, it really means you should make these memorials so obvious and so clear and block people's paths to wherever they're going so that they have to stop and maybe literally even trip over these stumbling blocks so that they will remember. So that we will place a stumbling block before the blind, those blind to the suffering of others. So you can see that this is a really interesting new way of understanding Judaism as it's come to be defined throughout the centuries, and how it's a living way, and how it's an enriching and meaningful way, and it's not superficial, and it's not just about manipulation and politics and fundraising, and it's not about just destruction. It's about saving the world for the future. All right, so then the next, I'm just going to talk about a few more of these. One one entire book is about adaptation, which I think is just perfect for our day. You know, adaptation, I mean, Jews, we have been people known for our ability to adapt. That's how we've survived all these centuries. I mean, you think about 1848, when there was a cholera epidemic, and Rabbi Israel Salanter ordered his community on Yom Kippur to eat. And he sat, according to legend at least, and ate in front of them. It wasn't like takeout from a Chinese restaurant, as I understand, but he ate in front of them, famously, so that from the start, we know that Judaism has always been flexible, especially during extreme times of disruption. One of the prevailing concepts, values of the Torah of Sinai is called pikuach nefesh, to save a life. And we are obligated to save a life, even when it means breaking Shabbat, breaking Yom Kippur. And that sets the tone for this mitzvah of adaptation. We saw this in Germany, our 2017 group, when we went to Olympic Stadium, and our guide, who was a wonderful guide there, talked about just what went on during the Olympics, and we saw the Nazi statues and other paraphernalia were still being displayed, including in German, and then in Latin, the words, meaning faster, higher, stronger, the Olympic credo. And of course, that was intended to be shown by Hitler as a way of demonstrating German racial superiority. In the fair-haired Aryan body, you see these statues and all of that. But our guide said, Hitler had it all wrong. And it sounded like this is what he'd been learning in a very sound German educational system since the Holocaust that has tried to help Germans understand where they went wrong. And he said Hitler thought that Darwinism was all about the prevailing of the survival of the fittest, of the Aryan physical superiority. But that wasn't what Darwin was talking about at all, our guide Dennis said. Darwin was talking about adaptation. And of course, those who understand the biology, those who understand what Darwinism is all about, understand that the survival of species has to do with our ability to adapt, to change, to adapt. And that has always been the Jewish way. Torah of Sinai, not by might, not by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord of hosts. Well, at Auschwitz, we truly became the people, not of the book, but the people of the rope-a-dope. And while adaptation is not specific to the Holocaust, there are so many stories of how Jews were able to adapt and change in order to survive. And Jewish culture has also been forced to adapt and change. And one thing I do in the book is talk a lot about how we need to change and adapt to different notions of God as we move forward. How we cannot conceive of the same kind of God that they conceived of before Auschwitz, because the question always has to come to mind, where was God at Auschwitz? And Yitz Greenberg would say that anyone who can come up with a theory of where God was and imagine small children being thrown into the flames as they were, then your theory passes muster. But I still haven't come up with one. So we've needed to adapt. We've needed to understand Judaism's need to adapt. And this rope-a-dope game is going on to this day. We can teach the world how to change by necessity. Last week, the conservative movement said it's okay to do this on Shabbat, to have video streaming and Zoom services, to count minions in this manner. When we had our Zoom Seders, it was the perfect example of how we've become the most adaptive religion. We were able to quickly take the Seder, which, by the way, was an adaptation in its origins of the Passover sacrifice once the temple was destroyed, and we adapted it to our needs. Judaism has a bias for change, and now in the COVID-19 era, the most socially disruptive event since the Holocaust, it is leading to a burst of innovation in the Jewish world and beyond. So, Alyssa, can I go a little bit longer, or do we want to stop for questions at this point?
Sure, go ahead. You have one question so far.
Okay, all right, so let me go ahead because I'm interested. I don't know about you. But no, there are a couple more things that placing God before me always. That's actually number 8 in the Mitzvah list. There's a small museum in Krakow that displays photos and artifacts. Let me see if I can find it. Okay, that's Judy. Let's see if I can find it. Yeah, here it is. Okay. Anyway, in Krakow, it displays this stone tablet, and it's the Museum of Galician Jewry, and anyway, it's beautiful, as you can see, and it has the verse, which is found on many arks in many synagogues. It says, "For know before whom you stand, da lifnei mi Ta'omed, but also I place God before myself always, which is a quote, and from Psalm 16.
Rabbi, you're not sharing that.
Oh, I'm sorry. Let me do that. Okay, here we go. See it now? Good, thank you. I know you're all wondering. This was just a test to make sure that people were paying attention. Okay, thank you. So here is the stone, and it is the only such pre-war tablet to have survived intact in a synagogue in Polish Galicia. So it is an astounding stone. You can see it actually is donated in someone's memory. And here is where it says, Shiviti Adonai lenegdi tamid, from Psalm 16. What makes this astonishing is that this simple, pure statement of faith and continuity, the only one to have survived intact, a stone tablet that not even the Nazis could destroy, nor Moses for that matter, the all-time tablet shatterer, who destroyed the tablets of Sinai at the slightest provocation, you might recall. This tablet was found at the last remaining synagogue in the pretty tree-lined Polish countryside town of Auschwitz, what the Germans called it. And this is a little town. We walked through it in the March of the Living. 1 mile from the hell that nearly destroyed the Jewish people and all of human civilization, somehow this reminder of a bygone, simpler era withstood the fallout of the moral detonation that took place right down the street. Maybe the discovery of this preserved tablet teaches us that in the Torah of Auschwitz, Psalm 16 is calling on us to place Auschwitz itself before us always. Not the place of death and destruction, but the place of renewal and hope. This synagogue, the place that now exists forever, reminds us where hate ultimately leads, the place visited by more people every year than were killed there, Auschwitz itself, the place of pilgrimage for heads of state and leaders of all faith traditions, and a place where thousands of Jewish youth congregate every year for Jewish youth's annual spring awakening, the March of the Living. That Auschwitz has become, in a sense, a holy place. And from catastrophe comes sanctity. Okay, so a couple of us I'm just going to say very quickly. One of the books deals specifically with destroying racism and promoting equality and reverence for life. That perhaps is its own and most important mitzvah of Holocaust remembrance, because as we know, racism was the foundation for all that happened, and unfortunately it is a sickness that remains today. The eradication of racism, one might say, and I put this in Mitzvah 41, is a restatement of the second commandment, that we should have no false gods before God. And the false god is racism, which places some groups of human beings higher than others, and ultimately, taken to its logical extreme, a single person above all and above God. So we should be obsessed with that. Bearing witness is the final mitzvah. All right, let's see if I can show you that. And there's our friend Judy. I don't know if Judy's on this call, but I hope she is. She appears prominently and has a place in my heart forever. She was on that March of the Living in 2010, and it was her first return to Auschwitz. And it was also a time when she discovered where her sister most likely perished in Belgium. And she brought some of the kids to the barracks. She remembered every inch of Auschwitz-Birkenau. And one of the teens took it upon herself to adopt Judy's story, to carry that story with her once Judy is no longer with us. This teen's promise epitomizes what it means to be a Jewish witness. And here in this chapter, I talk about it in context of the Shema, the ayin of the Shema and the dalet of the Shema, the two enlarged letters that mean witness. And then I say for Jews, that's a true witness protection program. And that is the last major point made in the book. So I'm going to just read, if I can, the last paragraph of the book. So then, you really don't have to read it. You've heard everything that's important right now. Okay. Counting in decades rather than days, we've now reached the end of Shiva for the Holocaust. It is time to re-engage with the world, to be prepared to re-enter history, or perhaps to enter it for the first time, not as victims, but as witnesses. It is time to descend from the mountain of shoes, bearing in our arms the Torah of Auschwitz, much as Moses bore the 2 tablets of stone from Sinai's peak. The prevailing message is life-affirming, despite the suffering recorded in its chronicles. The events are now history, but the question before us is not how to keep the anguish immediate while a new layer of green covers the bloodied sacred ground. It is rather, how do we render its lessons indelible by allowing it to raise us from the bloody, muddy, mossy muck? How can we acknowledge that the time to weep has yielded, as always, to a time to dance, not with a shadow of Amalek, but with an eternal life force, with renewal and hope, while acknowledging that these tears will never completely go away? How can we enable the anguish and the anger to be absorbed into the realm of ritual and story, despite the pain, despite the continued presence of anti-Semitism and hate in our world, and thereby enable the Holocaust to become transcendent and ever-present? Once that happens, and as I hope I've demonstrated, it is truly beginning to happen, we will rise completely and joyously from our mourning bench, and the shoes of Majdanek will lie dormant no more, and the Jewish people and so many others will join in an eternal dance.
Yasher Koach, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Wow. What you are giving us so much to think about, and really everyone is clapping. And we have a few questions. I don't know if you can see them, but the first question is, wait a minute, it has to do with Israel. Let's see. Would we agree that if there was no Holocaust, there would not be a state of Israel?
That's a fascinating question. I think there are historians on both sides of this. I tend to believe that there would have been an attempt to create an Israel, but let's just back up. This is like the would you have killed baby Hitler at age 2, which is I discuss in the book too, because we can't imagine a world where the Holocaust didn't happen. That world would be so different from our world. For one thing, there would be 3 times as many Jews in this world. But that having been said, I would say the Holocaust was instrumental to the creation of Israel and to the viability of Israel in its earliest stages. Israel needed world recognition. Israel needed that UN vote. And that UN vote would not have gone in Israel's favor without a tremendous degree of sympathy/guilt on the part of world powers. In particular, we have to say the United States. I mean, this was one vote, the UN vote, that the US and the Soviets agreed on. And part of it also was that there were Jewish refugees, millions of them, and they didn't want them coming to New York, and Russians, God knows what they wanted. So I would say the Holocaust and Israel are inseparable, both in its creation and also now in the gestalt. The culture of Israel is so connected to the Holocaust in almost every decision that it makes. Okay.
Okay, so the next question is about the first chart you showed. Do you think that the number of the increase in the number of Holocaust usage can be attributed to the TV series Holocaust in the 70s?
I wrote about that. In Germany, for sure, it changed everything in Germany. Elie Wiesel used to really, he wrote in the New York Times, he did not like that series. He felt it cheapened everything. It was superficial. Hey, it introduced Meryl Streep to the world, so it couldn't have been all bad. But he has a point. It was super. So many of the things, a lot of the children's material that comes out for the Holocaust, it's necessarily superficial. How can we possibly convey the enormity of it to kids completely, even honestly? But I do think that the Holocaust became part of the Jewish vernacular a few years before that. That series was in the late 70s, mid to late 70s, and when it happened was in May 1967, which I think many historians have pinpointed as the time when American Jews woke up to the fact that Israel could well be destroyed. If you remember, the Egyptians closed off the Straits of Tiran, and the UN dutifully removed their soldiers from the Sinai, allowing the Egyptians to basically surround Israel and have a noose at its neck. And Six-Day War happened, and that was miraculous, and that was wonderful. But those weeks before the Six-Day War, Israelis, American Jews, Jews throughout the world thought that another Holocaust was going to happen. The word Holocaust wasn't used right away, of course, and Elie Wiesel probably began that process in the early 60s. So it's understandable that it suddenly became more prominently used and part of the culture a generation later. Also, note that survivors took them a long time to start talking about it. Some still don't, but now they're doing it, and they're doing it in a whole different way as heroes. They're being treated as heroes, and they should be. And for so long, it was a matter of misplaced guilt, but real guilt that people felt for having survived. And it was wanting to just keep it quiet and not talk about it. Maybe the nightmares would go away. Now there's such an urgency to get those stories out there. There's even holograms that we're seeing of survivors at the Heritage Museum in New York and other places, so that we can keep those stories alive. So I don't think I don't think that curve is going to be flattened. I really think it's still going to rise. There is some Holocaust illiteracy that we need to deal with, but most people sort of know what we're talking about when we talk about the Holocaust.
So, Rabbi, do you think or hope that that also many non-Jews will read this book? And can the publisher estimate how many non-Jewish people buy the book?
I would hope that will happen. I certainly hope that it will be read by Jews first and foremost. It has, unlike the Menschmarks book, this one has been positioned more for a Jewish audience because if you try to make things more neutral, sometimes you sacrifice certain texture. You sacrifice some of the, I can use certain expressions, whatever, if I'm talking to mishpacha. It makes it a little bit easier to convey some of the things that need to be conveyed. There is one chapter, though, only one chapter, that is specifically about Jews and the Jewish people. And that's the one that I haven't even talked about today. One of the more radical ideas that I present, which is that we should change the definition of who is a Jew to a more umbrella definition that comes from the law of return in Israel. But in fact, the law of return, which defines a Jew in a very broad way, so that any Jew who is facing persecution can move to Israel and find a home there. That law of return comes from the Nuremberg laws, which were some of the most discriminatory, horrible laws ever enacted. And yet, based on that, I mean, it's the last laugh on Hitler to say that we're going to use those Nuremberg laws, which define a Jew in a very broad sense of having one Jewish grandparent, basically, and that's going to save the Jewish people. So that chapter really is Judeo-specific, but the rest of it can be read by anyone, and I hope it will be.
Okay, so here's a comment and a question. Beautiful perspective, Rabbi. I was always inspired by the story of the Jews in the camps who chose life from their souls. So why shouldn't we embrace it from that energy rather than from the energy propagated to keep us in the dark?
Well, that's a question more people are asking, and we have reached a point where enough people have no direct memory of it that the Holocaust can be treated a little differently. Obviously, reverently. Obviously, with survivors in our midst, we have to treat it reverently. But even if we're survivors not in our midst anymore, the enormity of the Holocaust just cannot be measured. At the same time, we need to be able to gently integrate it into the culture so that we can look for the eternal lessons and understand that some of them are indeed eternal. And I, for the lack of time, I didn't include in this reading a section where I talk about comparing the great heroes of the Bible to people like Raoul Wallenberg and Elie Wiesel and Viktor Frankl, and the influence they've had on our society. Anne Frank. I think Anne Frank is going to be, in 1,000 years, remembered like the biblical Ruth. That these are going to stand the test of time, and not in a purely sad way. One thing, this is a little bit more extreme, but I also talk about it. We know that we've reached the end of Shiva, the 70 years, because it's at about that point over the last few years that people have started, mainstream comedians have started to tell jokes about the Holocaust. Now, I'm not thrilled with it. Larry David told a joke on SNL, you might remember, like 2 years ago. It was one of those, kind of, otherwise, how was the play, Mrs. Lincoln type jokes, which maybe it's still too soon to use that. But with the Holocaust, we're starting to see it from the younger generation, especially. And there's a tendency toward irreverence, which, is a cultural thing among, I'm not going to classify any generation, but among a certain age group, that is it. And in fact, maybe they got it from me. They got it from my age group. We were pretty irreverent too, but we were never irreverent about the Holocaust. And we're now beginning to see that happen. So things are changing very dramatically. And, I think that question points out that fact.
Okay, this is about March of the Living. As a participant with the March of the Living, how do you assess that program, ways of dealing with victimization, perpetuation, particularly for such an impressionable stage in youth's lives?
Yeah, and that is an issue. It's something that concerned me when I was on it, and I'm not sure has been completely resolved. There are also political agendas that, similar to Birthright Israel in a way, come into play. But anything that treats Jews as purely victims and tries to sort of beat into kids a sense of victimhood is very dangerous. We brought a few psychologists with our group to try to help people process what they were seeing. So there's a fine line. We want people to become the witnesses. We want them to know the facts, most importantly, to know the history, because we are now the ones who are going to convey those facts. And there are no alternative facts to the Holocaust. And I've kept this distinctly apolitical, but it's noteworthy that the first issue that came up with the current administration having to do with truth issues had to do with Holocaust Remembrance Day, which happens the week after the inauguration, where Jews were left out of the administration's proclamation of Holocaust Remembrance Day. And in relation to everything else, it's probably not that significant, but it's symbolic because the Holocaust and Holocaust denial, which I'm not accusing the administration of, but Holocaust denial, the denial of the Jewish tragedy of the Holocaust, is the embodiment. It is the canary in the coal mine of big lies and of fake news. That, as I said, Hitler invented the term fake news. So if we're talking about the importance of the Holocaust in that sense, it's really important to bring that up as as in part of the ethical lessons that it teaches us.
Okay, so we have one question and one comment before we wrap this up, because people are being very patient. Rabbi, it's about God on Trial. Have you seen the theatrical production God on Trial? I thought it was absolutely outstanding from both an acting and substantive perspective. It raises similar questions to those addressed in your book, yet reaches a different conclusion in terms of lessons learned from Auschwitz.
I read it a long time ago. I'm trying to remember. I know I have not seen it. And Steve, I'd love to hear what those different conclusions are, if there's a way to unmute yourself and maybe share that.
Sure, I think I'm unmuted now. Can you hear me, Rabbi?
Yes, I can.
Perfect. It's on video, so I believe you can get it on the library, get it online. I purchased a copy. I saw it on PBS. It's extraordinarily well done. It involves prisoners in Auschwitz in a barrack. They were all scheduled to be put to death shortly. And they debate, they decide they're going to create a court. Some of them are murderers, some of them are lawyers, and some are doctors, all different cross sections of the Jewish community. And they put together a defense team for God, and they put together a prosecuting team. The arguments, the strength of this production was extraordinary. The lessons learned are difficult there. They embody a sense of sorrow and sadness. Perhaps you would call it victimhood, but there is a positive aspect. God, by the way, I believe, if I remember the movie right, was convicted. And I commend it to everyone. God was not there was the conclusion, and why wasn't God there if there was ever a God? And it causes us to question all the theoretical basis, or theological basis rather, of our understanding what Judaism means to us back in the days of Sinai as well as today. I think it was produced maybe 10 years ago. It is one of the finest productions I've ever seen of this kind.
Yeah, and it's based on, I think that was a true story.
Yes, sir.
But also other similar stories, Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev and others coming out of the pogrom era and other times of Jewish suffering, where God is put on trial, and it's a common Jewish thing to do. And in the end, God is convicted. And is this what happens in this story, where then they say, okay, God's convicted. All right, now let's let's daven mincha.
Yeah.
It's somewhat paradoxical. I talk about God in different ways throughout the book. Ultimately, the Torah of Auschwitz is human-centric. There's an ecological chapter which talks about how the earth has been given to us to tend and to care for, and we can't depend on God to save it for us. But even beyond that, there's a chapter which talks about which gives several hints of theologies, more sort of impressionistic points that I try to make as to how we might begin the journey back to conceiving of God, to understanding of God, without, of course, trying to cling to old theological models that are frankly distasteful at a time when such horrible things have been allowed to happen.
I agree. And
So,
somebody asked, just Elisa, just one moment. Somebody did ask, and I know, Rabbi, you'd be interested in seeing it. I Googled it, and it's available for free on the internet. So you'll see it on YouTube. It's an hour and 25 minutes to an hour and 30, 125, 21. So it's available for free. Just Google God on Trial video, and you'll see it. And it's spectacular.
That's
And
great.
I think it'd be interesting to read it,
Yeah.
watch it rather, in connection with reading the book itself. It's very interesting to get a deep perspective of how we can view Auschwitz and the lessons learned.
If only I had time, in my house to sort of hang out and watch these things, just haven't been able to do that. But yeah, yes, I will.
So on that note, I'd just like to say that one of the comments we got is that we have greetings from Illinois from a former president of the Jewish Historical Society, Maggie Levy, and our IT person, Bernie Levy, are tuning in from Illinois, as well as people from all over Connecticut and Westchester. And of over 70 people have been with us this morning for a very thought-provoking and stimulating and perhaps questioning morning. And we look forward to hearing more from you and from your writings, whether they're in the blog or in book form. And let's all give Rabbi Hammerman a big applause, or you can put up a hand if you can find a reaction. I'll give you a thumbs up. Rabbi, would you like, well, this is a dumb question, but would you like the last word?
No, of course not. But I would like to say one more thing. No, I think I said at the beginning that there have been some printing issues, but please don't, don't be shy. Go on to Amazon, order the book. If you want, you can let me know, and I will be happy to send you. We can do a virtual signing. I'll send you a sticker, which has the name of the book on it, whatever, from the publisher, with my signature and any other names or anything else you'd like me to do. And that way I can sign your book personally for you, even without ever seeing you directly. So the other thing is, if you want to read it right away, you can get the ebook. The Kindle version is out too.
Okay, great. Well, I want to thank everyone for coming this morning and listening to our book talks segment of the Jewish Historical Society, where our educational mission is to tell the story of Jewish history and to make sure that Jewish history is recognized in all over Fairfield County. And we have done that beautiful. Thank you, Rabbi Hammerman, for helping us with our mission this morning. I'm going to unmute everyone, and if you'd like, leave this meeting on for a few minutes if you'd like to talk to anybody. Thank you for coming, and I hope to see you in person.
Thank you.
Thank you, Liz.
So much.
Thank
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Thank you.